What if I told you that the very ground beneath your feet, the seasons you've lived through your entire life, and the delicate balance that makes Earth habitable could all change in a single night? What if tomorrow morning you woke up and everything you thought you knew about our planet had shifted, literally and catastrophically? Picture this. You go to bed tonight under familiar stars, and when you wake up, the sun rises from a completely different direction. The seasons have been thrown into chaos. What was once tropical paradise is now frozen wasteland, and the Arctic has become a sweltering desert. This isn't science fiction. This is what would happen if Earth's axis tilt changed overnight. Now, before you think this is just another doomsday scenario, let me tell you why this question matters. Earth's current tilt of 23.5 degrees isn't just some random cosmic accident. It's the precise angle that gives us our seasons, our weather patterns, and ultimately the stable climate that allowed human civilization to flourish. Change that angle, and you're not just changing the weather forecast, you're rewriting the entire rulebook of how our planet works. I'm about to walk you through exactly what would happen if Earth's axis suddenly shifted, and trust me, the implications are far more dramatic and immediate than you might imagine. We'll explore 3 different scenarios, from a moderate change that would still be catastrophic, to an extreme shift that would make our planet nearly unrecognizable. But first, let me show you just how delicately balanced our current situation really is. Right now, as you're watching this video, Earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees relative to our orbital plane around the Sun. This might not sound like much, but this precise angle is what creates the rhythm of life as we know it. When your hemisphere tilts toward the Sun, you get summer. When it tilts away, you get winter. The equator stays relatively stable year-round, while the poles experience months of continuous daylight followed by months of darkness. But here's what most people don't realize. This tilt isn't perfectly stable. It actually wobbles slightly over thousands of years, changing by just a degree or two. These tiny variations have been linked to ice ages and major climate shifts throughout Earth's history. Now imagine if that change happened not over millennia but overnight. Let's start with what scientists call a moderate scenario. Imagine Earth's tilt suddenly changed from 23.5 degrees to 35 degrees. That might not sound like a huge difference, but the consequences would be immediate and devastating. Within hours of this shift, the first thing you'd notice would be the sun's path across the sky. In many locations, the sun would appear to rise from an entirely different direction. Navigation systems worldwide would become instantly obsolete. Pilots would find their instruments completely unreliable. Ships at sea would lose their bearings. The global positioning system, which relies on precise calculations of Earth's rotation and position, would provide wildly inaccurate readings. But that's just the beginning. The real chaos would start with the weather. You see, our current weather patterns are driven by the way solar energy is distributed across the planet. The equator receives the most direct sunlight, while the poles receive the least. This creates temperature gradients that drive wind patterns, ocean currents, and storm systems. Change the tilt, and you fundamentally alter how energy flows through our atmosphere. Within days, regions that have never experienced winter would suddenly find themselves in the grip of freezing temperatures. The Sahara Desert, currently one of the hottest places on Earth, could see snow. Meanwhile, parts of Siberia might experience tropical heat for the first time in geological history. Ocean currents, those massive conveyor belts that regulate global climate, would begin to shift. The Gulf Stream, which keeps Western Europe warm despite its northern latitude, would weaken or change course entirely. This alone would trigger a climate crisis across multiple continents. But here's where it gets truly catastrophic: the ice caps. Antarctica and Greenland contain enough ice to raise global sea levels by over 200 feet if they melted completely. With a sudden change in axial tilt, vast portions of these ice sheets would suddenly find themselves exposed to direct sunlight for extended periods, or conversely, plunged into permanent darkness. Either scenario would trigger rapid changes in ice formation and melting. Areas of ice that have been stable for millions of years would begin to destabilize within weeks. The resulting sea level changes wouldn't happen gradually over decades as climate scientists currently predict. They would happen catastrophically fast, flooding coastal cities worldwide and displacing billions of people. And we haven't even talked about the most immediate danger: massive storms. The atmosphere, suddenly faced with completely new temperature gradients and pressure systems, would respond violently. Hurricane-force winds would develop in regions that have never seen them before. The jet stream, that high-altitude river of air that currently flows in predictable patterns, would break apart and reform in chaotic new configurations. Imagine tornadoes in the Amazon rainforest, picture typhoons in the Arctic, visualize blizzards in the Sahara and heat waves in Antarctica. The atmosphere would essentially be trying to find a new equilibrium, and that process would be marked by some of the most extreme weather events in human history. But let's push this scenario even further. What if the change wasn't moderate at all? What if Earth's axis suddenly shifted to 50 degrees or more? At this level of change, we're not talking about climate disruption anymore. We're talking about a fundamental transformation of our planet's habitability. Regions near the equator, which currently enjoy stable year-round temperatures, would experience extreme seasonal variations. Places like Singapore or Ecuador would swing from Arctic conditions to desert heat within the span of a single year. The tropics, as we know them, would cease to exist. Instead, they would become zones of extreme seasonal variation, with months of intense heat followed by months of bitter cold. The delicate ecosystems that have evolved over millions of years to thrive in stable tropical conditions would collapse. Meanwhile, the new polar regions, areas that might suddenly find themselves at the extremes of our planet's rotation, would face months of continuous daylight followed by months of total darkness. But unlike the current Arctic and Antarctic, these new polar regions wouldn't have had millions of years to develop ice sheets and specialized ecosystems. They would be raw, chaotic environments where life would struggle to adapt quickly enough to survive. The agricultural implications alone would be staggering. Every crop that humans currently depend on has evolved to thrive in specific climate conditions. Rice grows in warm, wet environments. Wheat prefers moderate temperatures with distinct seasons. Corn needs specific temperature ranges and daylight hours to mature properly. With an overnight change in axial tilt, virtually every agricultural region on Earth would suddenly find itself in completely unsuitable growing conditions. The Midwest United States, currently one of the world's bread baskets, might suddenly have a climate more like northern Canada or southern Chile. Meanwhile, the Amazon basin might experience conditions more like those currently found in northern Alaska. The result would be immediate and widespread crop failure on a scale never before seen in human history. Food supplies that took an entire growing season to produce would be lost overnight. Emergency food reserves, designed to last months or perhaps a year, would suddenly need to sustain billions of people for however long it took to figure out where and how to grow food in this new world. But even if we could solve the agricultural crisis, there's another problem that would emerge within weeks of the axis shift. Massive population displacement. Cities are built where they are for reasons that go far beyond historical accident. Coastal cities exist because of favourable harbours and mild maritime climates. Desert cities like Phoenix or Las Vegas exist because of predictable weather patterns and available water resources. Northern cities like Moscow or Stockholm are designed to handle specific types of winter weather. Change the axis overnight, and suddenly millions of people find themselves living in environments their cities weren't designed to handle. Imagine Miami suddenly experiencing Canadian winters, or Moscow facing desert heat. The infrastructure simply isn't there to cope with such dramatic changes. Water systems designed for one climate would fail in another. Buildings constructed to handle specific temperature ranges would become uninhabitable. Transportation networks optimized for certain weather patterns would shut down. Power grids designed around predictable seasonal energy demands would be overwhelmed by completely new usage patterns. The result would be mass migration on a scale that would dwarf any refugee crisis in human history. Entire populations would need to relocate to regions where the new climate was survivable. But those regions would already be dealing with their own dramatic changes. And here's the truly frightening part. We haven't even discussed the most extreme scenario yet. What if Earth's axis didn't just shift by 30 or 50 degrees, but flipped entirely? What if our planet suddenly found itself tilted at 90 degrees or more? At this level of change, we're not talking about climate catastrophe anymore. We're talking about the potential end of complex life on Earth as we know it. But that's exactly where we're heading. In the next part of this exploration, where we'll dive deep into the most extreme scenarios and discover just how fragile the balance really is that keeps our planet habitable. Because here's what you need to understand. Everything I've described so far, all the chaos and disruption from a moderate axis change, that's actually the optimistic scenario. The real question isn't whether humanity could survive a sudden axis shift. The question is whether our planet would remain recognizable at all. In an extreme axis shift scenario where Earth tilted 90 degrees or more, we'd be looking at something so catastrophic that it would make every disaster movie you've ever seen look like a children's bedtime story. But to understand why this would be so devastating, we need to talk about something most people never think about: the physics of what holds our world together. Right now, Earth spins like a perfectly balanced top, rotating once every 24 hours. This rotation creates what we call the Coriolis effect, which influences everything from the direction water swirls down a drain to the massive circulation patterns that drive our weather systems. But here's the thing: a sudden axis change wouldn't just alter our tilt, it would fundamentally disrupt the rotational dynamics that have remained stable for billions of years. Picture trying to suddenly change the axis of a spinning gyroscope while it's in motion. The gyroscope would wobble violently, potentially flying apart from the internal stresses. Earth wouldn't fly apart, but the internal stresses would be unlike anything our planet has experienced since its formation. The very ground beneath your feet would shift and buckle as the planet tried to adjust to its new rotational reality. Let me paint you a picture of what a 90-degree axis shift would actually mean for someone living through it. Instead of the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, it would essentially rise at what we currently call the North Pole and set at the South Pole. But that's not even the strangest part. With this extreme tilt, different parts of Earth would experience what scientists call permanent seasons. Imagine regions that would be locked in continuous summer for 6 months, followed by 6 months of continuous winter. But these wouldn't be the gentle seasons you're familiar with. These would be seasons of unimaginable extremes. During the summer phase, areas would receive continuous direct sunlight for months on end. Temperatures would soar to levels that would make Death Valley look like a pleasant spring day. We're talking about surface temperatures that could exceed 180 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. The atmosphere itself would begin to behave in ways we've never observed, creating pressure systems and wind patterns that would make hurricanes look like gentle breezes. Then, 6 months later, these same regions would plunge into a darkness so complete and cold that they would make the Antarctic winter seem tropical by comparison. Without sunlight for months, temperatures would plummet to levels that would freeze the atmosphere itself. We're talking about conditions so extreme that the very air would begin to liquefy and fall as rain. But here's where the scenario gets truly mind-bending: the oceans. Our oceans are currently in a delicate state of circulation, with warm water near the equator and cold water near the poles creating currents that distribute heat around the globe. Change the axis to 90 degrees, and you completely flip this system on its head. Literally. The equatorial regions, which currently drive much of our ocean circulation, would suddenly find themselves in positions equivalent to our current polar regions. The massive temperature differences between the new summer and winter zones would create ocean currents of unprecedented power and violence. Imagine tsunamis that aren't caused by earthquakes, but by the sheer thermal expansion and contraction of seawater as it moves between these extreme temperature zones. Picture whirlpools the size of entire countries forming as the oceans try to establish new circulation patterns. Visualize walls of water hundreds of feet high, moving across ocean basins as the thermal dynamics create pressure differentials that dwarf anything in recorded history. The atmospheric consequences would be equally staggering. Our current weather systems depend on the relatively stable temperature gradient from equator to poles. Remove that stability, and you remove the foundation of atmospheric circulation as we know it. Instead of the predictable weather patterns that have allowed human civilization to develop agriculture and permanent settlements, you'd have an atmosphere in constant, violent flux. Storm systems would develop that would make the most powerful hurricanes in recorded history look like gentle summer breezes. We're talking about atmospheric phenomena that don't even have names yet because they've never been observed. Imagine tornadoes that persist for months instead of minutes, stretching across entire continents. Picture lightning storms so intense and continuous that they would fundamentally alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere. Visualize pressure waves moving through the air with such force that they would level mountains. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this extreme scenario isn't the immediate chaos, is what would happen to the fundamental chemistry of life itself. Every living organism on Earth has evolved under the current axial configuration. Plants have developed photosynthesis cycles based on predictable daylight hours. Animals have evolved migration patterns, breeding cycles, and metabolic processes that depend on seasonal regularity. Even the microscopic organisms that form the foundation of every food chain are adapted to current temperature and light patterns. Change the axis to 90 degrees, and you're not just changing the environment, you're pulling the rug out from under 4 billion years of evolutionary adaptation. The result wouldn't just be mass extinction. It would be the collapse of the biological processes that make complex life possible. Photosynthesis, the process that produces the oxygen you're breathing right now, would become impossible in many regions during the extended dark periods. The plants that do survive the temperature extremes would face months without sunlight, followed by months of solar radiation so intense it would literally cook them. The ocean ecosystems would face an even more immediate crisis. Marine life depends on temperature-stable environments and predictable current patterns for everything from feeding to reproduction. The thermal shock alone would kill most ocean life within weeks. The massive changes in ocean chemistry as water temperatures swung between extremes would create conditions so toxic that even the most resilient microorganisms would struggle to survive. And here's something that will really blow your mind. We haven't even discussed the most extreme possibility yet. What if the axis didn't just shift but began to wobble unpredictably? What if, instead of settling into a new stable configuration, Earth began to tumble through space like a broken gyroscope? In this scenario, there would be no predictable seasons at all. Different parts of the planet would experience random periods of extreme heat and cold, with no pattern or warning. The sun might rise from the north one day, and the south the next. Weather systems would never have a chance to stabilize before being disrupted by yet another change in solar orientation. This is where we move beyond catastrophe into something approaching planetary chaos. The very concept of climate would become meaningless. Instead of weather patterns, you'd have random atmospheric violence. Instead of ecosystems, you'd have biological graveyards where life forms died faster than they could adapt. But here's the question that should keep you awake at night. How close is our planet to experiencing something like this? Because while an overnight axis change might seem impossible, the forces that could cause such a shift are very real, and they're operating around us right now. Massive asteroid impacts, gravitational interactions with passing celestial bodies, or even internal planetary processes could theoretically trigger such changes. And when you realize that Earth's axis has shifted dramatically in the past, though over much longer timescales, the scenario starts to feel less like science fiction and more like a reminder of just how precarious our existence really is. The truly sobering part is that we've only explored the immediate physical consequences so far. We haven't even begun to discuss what this would mean for human civilization, technology, or the social structures that hold our world together. Because when the very ground shifts beneath your feet, everything else you thought was solid starts to crumble too. The collapse wouldn't just be environmental, it would be the complete breakdown of every system that makes modern civilization possible. Think about this. Every single piece of infrastructure on Earth is designed around the assumption that our planet behaves in predictable ways. Your house is built to withstand the specific weather patterns of your region. Your city's power grid is designed for seasonal energy demands that follow a 23.5-degree tilt cycle. Your food supply chain assumes crops will grow where they've always grown. Now imagine trying to explain to 7 billion people that none of that matters anymore, that the fundamental assumptions underlying every aspect of human society have just been shattered in a single night. The first casualties wouldn't be from the extreme weather or temperature changes. They'd be from the complete breakdown of communication and transportation systems. Satellites, which rely on precise calculations of Earth's rotation and position, would lose contact with ground stations. The GPS satellites you use to navigate would be broadcasting coordinates for a planet that no longer exists in the same orientation. Air traffic control systems would fail immediately. Imagine thousands of aircraft in the sky when the axis shift occurs, their navigation systems suddenly providing readings that make no sense. Pilots would find themselves flying toward destinations that are no longer where their instruments say they should be. The magnetic compass, humanity's most ancient navigation tool, would become unreliable as the planet's magnetic field interacts with its new rotational dynamics. Ships at sea would face an even more terrifying scenario. Maritime navigation has relied on celestial positioning for thousands of years. Suddenly, the stars that sailors have used to guide their journeys would appear in completely different positions. The North Star, that fixed point that has guided countless voyages, would no longer point north. Ships carrying essential supplies, fuel and food would be lost at sea, unable to reach their destinations just when those supplies would be needed most. But here's what really should terrify you. The financial markets would collapse within hours of people understanding what had happened. Modern economies are built on the assumption of predictable agricultural cycles, stable supply chains, and consistent energy demands. The moment investors realized that every agricultural region on Earth had become unsuitable for its current crops, that every coastal city might soon be underwater or frozen solid, that every transportation route had become unreliable, the global economy would experience a crash that would make the Great Depression look like a minor market correction. Currency would become meaningless overnight. What good is money when the food systems that money is supposed to buy access to have completely collapsed? What value does a stock certificate have when the company it represents is located in a region that's suddenly experiencing Arctic conditions in what used to be a tropical climate? The social implications would be even more catastrophic than the economic ones. Human societies are held together by shared expectations about how the world works. We cooperate because we believe in predictable rules, stable institutions, and the assumption that tomorrow will be roughly similar to today. Remove that assumption, and you remove the foundation of civilization itself. Within days of the axis shift, you'd see the breakdown of law and order in regions where survival became the immediate priority. Police departments and military units would be dealing with unprecedented natural disasters, while simultaneously trying to maintain order among populations that suddenly realized their governments couldn't protect them from planetary-scale catastrophes. Hospitals would be overwhelmed not just by injuries from extreme weather events, but by the psychological trauma of entire populations realizing that the stable world they'd always known had ended overnight. Mental health systems, already strained in many countries, would completely collapse under the weight of universal existential crisis. Religious institutions would face their own upheaval as people struggled to understand why their deity had allowed such devastation, while simultaneously seeking comfort in faith communities that might be the only stable social structures remaining. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this scenario is how it would affect human knowledge and culture. Libraries, universities, and data centers are located in specific places because those places have historically had stable climates suitable for preserving information. Suddenly expose the Library of Congress to 6 months of 150-degree heat, followed by 6 months of 100-degree cold, and you've just incinerated thousands of years of accumulated human knowledge. Digital infrastructure would be particularly vulnerable. Data centers require carefully controlled temperatures and reliable power supplies. Server farms that store everything from social media posts to scientific research to government databases would fail as their cooling systems became inadequate for the new temperature extremes, or as power grids collapsed under unprecedented demand patterns. The internet itself might fragment and fail as the physical infrastructure connecting different regions became unusable. Undersea cables could be damaged by the violent ocean current changes we discussed earlier. Satellite communication networks would be disrupted by the navigation failures. Even local networks would struggle as the electrical grid tried to cope with completely new seasonal energy demands. This means that even if pockets of human civilization managed to survive the immediate physical catastrophes, they might lose the ability to communicate with each other or access the accumulated knowledge that would be essential for rebuilding. Imagine trying to figure out how to grow food in your new climate conditions, but having no way to access agricultural research or communicate with other survivors who might be facing similar challenges. The loss of scientific knowledge would be particularly devastating, because understanding and adapting to the new planetary conditions would require unprecedented scientific cooperation. Climate scientists would need to develop entirely new models. Agricultural researchers would need to figure out which crops could grow in the new zones. Engineers would need to design infrastructure for weather patterns that had never been observed before. But how do you conduct science when the laboratories are destroyed, the research institutions are dealing with survival crises, and the communication networks that allow scientists to collaborate have failed? How do you preserve and share knowledge when the systems designed to do that are breaking down just when they're needed most? The psychological impact on survivors would create its own crisis. Humans are psychologically adapted to live in environments with predictable seasonal patterns. Our sleep cycles, our emotional rhythms, even our reproductive cycles are tied to the 24-hour day, and the seasonal changes that come from our current axial tilt suddenly subject people to 6 months of continuous daylight followed by 6 months of darkness, and you're not just changing their environment, you're disrupting fundamental biological processes that have evolved over millions of years. Sleep disorders would become universal. Seasonal affective disorder, currently experienced by a relatively small percentage of the population during normal winters, would affect everyone during the extended dark periods. The social fabric that holds communities together would fray under the stress of these biological and psychological disruptions. Family structures, community organizations, and cultural institutions all depend on people being able to function psychologically and socially. Remove that foundation, and even the human relationships that might otherwise provide comfort and support during a crisis would begin to break down. Children would be particularly vulnerable, not just physically but developmentally. Child development depends on predictable environmental cues and stable social structures. Children growing up in the aftermath of an axis shift would be developing in a world so chaotic and unstable that the very concept of normal childhood development would become meaningless. Educational systems would collapse not just because school buildings might be destroyed or unsuitable for the new climate conditions, but because the entire curriculum would suddenly be obsolete. What's the point of teaching geography when the climate zones have completely changed? How do you teach agriculture when all the traditional farming knowledge is no longer applicable? What do you do with history lessons when they describe a world that no longer exists? But here's the most chilling realization of all. Even if small groups of humans managed to survive the immediate catastrophe, even if they found ways to grow food and maintain shelter in the new conditions, even if they preserved some fragment of human knowledge and culture, they would be starting over in a world that might shift again. Because once Earth's rotational stability had been disrupted once, there would be no guarantee it wouldn't happen again. The planet might settle into a new stable configuration, or it might continue to wobble and shift unpredictably. Survivors would have to build their new civilization knowing that everything they created could be destroyed again by forces completely beyond their control. This uncertainty would fundamentally change how humans think about the future. Why build permanent structures if the climate might change again? Why invest in long-term projects if the very ground might shift beneath your feet? How do you plan for tomorrow when the forces that shape your world are no longer predictable? The survivors of an axis shift would be living in a fundamentally different relationship with their planet than any humans in history. Instead of seeing Earth as a stable home, they would see it as an unpredictable and potentially hostile environment that had already betrayed them once and might do so again. And yet, despite all this catastrophic possibility, there's something profound to consider about human resilience and adaptability. Because throughout our species' history, we've survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and countless other planetary changes. We've adapted to environments from the Arctic to the desert, from sea level to high mountains. The question isn't whether some humans would survive an axis shift. The question is what kind of species we would become afterward, and whether the civilization that emerged from such a catastrophe would still be recognizably human in the ways that matter most. The psychological transformation of humanity itself would be perhaps the most profound consequence of all. Think about how fundamentally our entire worldview would have to shift. For thousands of years, humans have built their understanding of existence around the concept of permanence. We build monuments intended to last forever. We make plans decades into the future. We assume that the basic rules governing our world will remain constant. But after experiencing a planetary axis shift, any surviving humans would carry with them the knowledge that nothing is truly permanent, that the most fundamental assumptions about reality can be shattered overnight. This wouldn't just change how they think about the future, it would rewire their entire relationship with existence itself. Imagine trying to raise children in this new world. How do you teach them to have hope for the future when you've witnessed the complete destruction of everything your previous generation believed was stable? How do you encourage them to build, to create, to invest in long-term projects when you know firsthand that planetary forces can undo everything in a single night? The very concept of home would be transformed. Right now, we think of home as a place, a specific location with familiar landmarks and predictable seasons. But survivors of an axis shift would have to learn to think of home as something portable, something that exists in relationships and memories rather than in geography. Because geography itself would have proven unreliable. Cultural traditions that have been passed down for thousands of years would suddenly become irrelevant or impossible to maintain. Think about harvest festivals, celebrations tied to specific seasonal cycles, religious observances that depend on predictable celestial events. All of these would either disappear entirely or need to be completely reimagined for a world where seasons themselves had become chaotic. Language itself would have to evolve. We'd need new words to describe weather phenomena that had never existed before. New concepts to explain social structures adapted to extreme environmental instability. New philosophies to help people find meaning in a universe that had revealed itself to be far more unpredictable than anyone had imagined. The survivors would also face a unique form of trauma that no humans in history had ever experienced. Most disasters, no matter how devastating, are local or temporary. Even global catastrophes like ice ages happen gradually over thousands of years, giving life time to adapt. But an overnight axis shift would be a planetary trauma, a wound to the Earth itself that every surviving human would carry in their memory. This shared trauma could either unite the remaining human populations in unprecedented ways, or it could fragment them beyond repair. On one hand, the experience of surviving something so catastrophic might create bonds between survivors that transcend traditional divisions of nationality, race, or religion. When you've all witnessed the end of the world as you knew it, previous conflicts might seem petty and meaningless. On the other hand, the stress of survival in such harsh new conditions might intensify conflicts over scarce resources. Groups that manage to find habitable zones might become extremely territorial, unwilling to share with others for fear that there isn't enough for everyone. The breakdown of traditional authority structures might lead to new forms of tribalism based purely on survival necessity. But here's something that might surprise you. The technological development of post-Axis humanity might actually accelerate in some ways. When you know that your environment is fundamentally unstable, you become highly motivated to develop technologies that can adapt quickly to changing conditions. Mobile architecture, rapid deployment agriculture, weather prediction systems designed for chaos rather than pattern recognition. The survivors would be forced to innovate in ways that current humanity has never had to consider. How do you design a city that can be relocated when the climate zone shifts? How do you develop food production systems that can adapt to completely new growing conditions within a single season? How do you create communication networks that can function when all the traditional navigation reference points have become unreliable? These challenges might drive advances in biotechnology, materials science, and systems thinking that could surpass anything we've achieved in our current stable environment. Necessity, after all, is the mother of invention, and never in human history would necessity have been more pressing than in the aftermath of a planetary axis shift. The relationship between humans and nature would be forever changed as well. Right now, we often think of ourselves as separate from, or even in control of nature. We build dams to control rivers, air conditioning to control climate, and cities to create artificial environments insulated from natural forces. But survivors of an axis shift would have experienced firsthand just how powerless humans really are against planetary forces. This might lead to a much more humble and integrated approach to living with natural systems. Instead of trying to control nature, they might focus on learning to flow with it, to adapt quickly to its changes rather than resisting them. This could result in a form of human civilization that's more sustainable and resilient than anything we've created so far. A society that builds flexibility into everything it creates, that maintains multiple backup systems for essential functions, that treats adaptation as a core skill rather than an emergency response. The spiritual and philosophical implications would be equally profound. Many of our current religions and philosophies are based on concepts of divine order, cosmic purpose, or natural law. But what happens to these belief systems when the natural world demonstrates that it can change its fundamental rules without warning? Some survivors might lose faith entirely, concluding that existence is random and meaningless. Others might develop new forms of spirituality based on accepting uncertainty and finding meaning in the face of chaos. Still others might interpret the axis shift as a test, a challenge that humanity was meant to overcome as part of some larger cosmic purpose. These different philosophical responses could lead to entirely new forms of human culture and social organization. Communities might form around shared beliefs about how to interpret and respond to the axis shift experience. Some might become hyper-focused on scientific understanding, determined to predict and prevent future catastrophes. Others might embrace mystical or spiritual approaches to dealing with uncertainty. The concept of time itself would be transformed. Right now, we organize our lives around predictable cycles: daily sunrise and sunset, weekly schedules, seasonal changes, annual events. But in a world where these cycles had been completely disrupted, humans would need to develop entirely new ways of organizing time and planning activities. This might lead to more flexible, adaptive approaches to scheduling and social coordination. Instead of rigid calendars based on astronomical events, communities might develop fluid time systems based on immediate environmental conditions and survival needs. The education of children would become one of the most critical challenges facing survivor communities. What do you teach children about the world when the world itself has proven to be fundamentally unpredictable? How do you prepare them for a future when you have no idea what conditions that future might bring? Traditional education focuses on passing down accumulated knowledge and cultural traditions. But post-Axis education would need to focus primarily on adaptability, resilience, and rapid learning. Children would need to learn not just facts, but how to quickly acquire new skills when circumstances change. They would need to develop comfort with uncertainty and the ability to maintain psychological stability in the face of constant environmental change. This educational challenge would extend to practical skills as well. Current education assumes that the skills you learn as a child will remain relevant throughout your life. But in a post-Axis world, the skills needed for survival might change dramatically as environmental conditions shift. Children would need to learn multiple backup skill sets and maintain the flexibility to abandon old approaches when they become obsolete. The question of genetic adaptation adds another layer of complexity to this scenario. While humans are remarkably adaptable behaviorally and technologically, we also adapt genetically over longer time periods. The extreme environmental conditions following an axis shift might create powerful selective pressures that could influence human evolution in ways we can't predict. Populations that survive in the new polar regions might develop genetic adaptations to extreme cold and extended darkness. Those surviving in the new tropical zones might evolve improved heat tolerance and resistance to intense solar radiation. Over many generations, these adaptations could lead to distinct human subspecies optimized for different climate zones. But genetic adaptation takes time, usually many generations. The immediate survivors would have to rely entirely on behavioral and technological adaptation to cope with their new environment. This makes the preservation of knowledge and the development of new technologies even more critical for short-term survival. The reconstruction of global civilization would face challenges that no previous recovery effort in human history has had to address. Usually, when civilizations collapse, they can rebuild using knowledge and techniques that worked in similar environments in the past. But post-Axis reconstruction would be happening in environmental conditions that no previous human civilization had ever experienced. Every aspect of rebuilding would require innovation rather than restoration. Agriculture would need to be developed from scratch for new climate zones. Architecture would need to be designed for weather patterns that had never existed before. Transportation networks would need to connect regions whose relative climates had completely changed. International cooperation, already challenging under normal circumstances, would become both more necessary and more difficult. The regions that remained most habitable after an axis shift might not correspond to current political boundaries. Survivor communities would need to work together across former national lines, while simultaneously competing for limited habitable territory. This could lead to entirely new forms of political organization based on environmental zones rather than historical territories. Governance structures would need to be both more flexible and more coordinated than anything we've seen before. Local communities would need autonomy to adapt quickly to changing conditions, while global coordination would be essential for managing resources and knowledge sharing. The preservation and recreation of human culture would become a conscious, deliberate process rather than something that happens naturally through tradition. Survivor communities would need to actively decide which aspects of previous human culture were worth preserving and which were no longer relevant to their new reality. This cultural curation process would likely vary dramatically between different survivor groups, leading to rapid cultural divergence. Some communities might focus on preserving scientific and technical knowledge. Others might prioritize art, music, and literature as sources of psychological comfort. Still others might develop entirely new cultural forms adapted to their changed circumstances. The long-term trajectory of human development would depend heavily on whether the axis shift settled into a new stable configuration or continued to change unpredictably. A new stable tilt would allow survivors to eventually adapt and rebuild a form of complex civilization, though one very different from what we know today. But if the planetary rotation remained unstable, with periodic shifts or continuous wobbling, human development might be permanently limited to small mobile communities focused primarily on survival rather than advancement. The energy and resources needed for complex civilization require some degree of environmental predictability that might never return. This uncertainty about the future would create a fundamental tension in post-Axis human society. Do you invest resources in building permanent infrastructure that might be destroyed by the next shift? Or do you focus entirely on mobility and short-term survival, potentially sacrificing the accumulation of knowledge and technology that makes complex civilization possible. Different communities would likely make different choices about this trade-off, leading to divergent paths of human development. Some might become highly mobile nomadic societies, while others might gamble on building permanent settlements in zones they hope will remain stable. The psychological burden of making these decisions would be enormous. Every major choice about how to organize society would carry the weight of potentially determining the future of human civilization. The stress of this responsibility, combined with the trauma of the initial catastrophe, would create mental health challenges unlike anything humans have previously faced. And yet, through all of this catastrophic possibility, there remains something uniquely human that might persist. Our capacity for hope, for cooperation, for finding meaning in the face of overwhelming challenges. These qualities have carried our species through previous existential threats, and they might be what ultimately determines whether post-Axis humanity can not just survive, but eventually thrive. The story of how humans might respond to an overnight axis shift is ultimately a story about the deepest aspects of human nature. Would we fragment and fight over scarce resources? Would we unite in the face of shared catastrophe? Would we lose hope entirely or find new sources of meaning in a changed world? These questions go beyond the immediate physical challenges of survival. They touch on fundamental questions about who we are as a species and what we're capable of when everything we thought we knew about our world is suddenly torn away. Because here's the thing that should both terrify and inspire you. While an overnight axis shift is an extreme scenario, it's not the only way our stable world could be disrupted. Climate change, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, or other planetary-scale catastrophes could create similar challenges for human civilization. The real value of thinking through these scenarios isn't to predict the future, but to understand the present. To recognize how much of what we take for granted depends on the continuation of current conditions. To appreciate the delicate balance that makes our current way of life possible. And perhaps most importantly, to consider what aspects of human civilization are truly essential and what are merely accidents of our particular historical moment. Because ultimately, the question of what would happen if Earth's axis changed overnight isn't really about astronomy or climatology. It's about resilience, adaptation, and the fundamental question of what it means to be human when everything else is stripped away. The survivors who managed to endure the first year of chaos would face a challenge that goes beyond anything we've discussed so far: the complete breakdown of humanity's collective memory. Think about this for a moment. Right now, human knowledge exists not just in books and computers, but in the minds of specialists scattered across the globe. There are maybe a few hundred people who truly understand how to manufacture semiconductors, a few thousand who know how to perform complex surgeries, tens of thousands who understand modern agriculture at the level needed to feed millions. But when the axis shifted overnight, these knowledge holders wouldn't be conveniently grouped together in safe locations. They'd be scattered across a planet where their expertise might suddenly become irrelevant anyway. The semiconductor engineer whose factory is now buried under 6 feet of snow. The surgeon whose hospital is dealing with 40-degree temperatures when it was built for tropical heat. The agricultural specialist whose lifetime of knowledge about growing corn in Iowa is useless when Iowa suddenly has the climate of northern Alaska. This represents something historians call knowledge collapse, but on a scale never before experienced by human civilization. It's not just that libraries would burn or hard drives would fail, it's that the living repositories of human expertise would be too busy surviving to pass on their knowledge. And even if they tried, much of that knowledge would no longer apply to the New World conditions. Imagine being one of the few remaining doctors in a survivor community. You know how to perform surgery, but the medical supplies are running out, and there's no way to manufacture more because the pharmaceutical companies are dealing with their own survival crises. You understand how antibiotics work, but the bacteria you're fighting have suddenly been exposed to completely new environmental pressures and are evolving in unpredictable ways. Your medical training assumed access to clean water, reliable electricity, and sterile environments, none of which exist in your new reality. This knowledge crisis would force survivor communities to make agonizing decisions about specialization versus generalization. In our current world, we can afford to have people who know everything about one narrow field because we assume the broader support systems will always be there. But in post-Axis communities, everyone would need to know a little bit about everything just to survive. The few remaining engineers would need to become farmers. The teachers would need to learn basic medical care. The farmers would need to understand construction and weather prediction. This forced generalization might make communities more resilient in some ways, but it would also mean losing the deep expertise that makes advanced technology and complex social systems possible. And here's where the scenario becomes truly haunting. The children born after the Axis shift would grow up in a world where the accumulated knowledge of human civilization was actively disappearing around them. They wouldn't just be learning in schools with limited resources. They'd be growing up as witnesses to humanity's greatest intellectual collapse. These children would hear stories from adults about the old world, where you could fly across oceans in hours, where information from anywhere on Earth was available instantly, where diseases that were now killing people had been easily treatable. But to them, these stories would sound like fairy tales. The technology that made such things possible would be as mythical to them as magic. This creates a psychological phenomenon that psychologists call generational amnesia. Each generation accepts as normal the degraded conditions they grow up with, not recognizing them as degraded because they have no personal experience of anything better. The children of Axis shift survivors might adapt remarkably well to their harsh new reality, but in doing so, they'd lose any sense that humanity was capable of more. Over just 2 or 3 generations, the memory of advanced civilization could fade entirely. The grandchildren of the survivors might look at the ruins of cities and highways and skyscrapers and assume they were built by some previous species, not by their own ancestors just a few decades earlier. This amnesia wouldn't just be about technology. Cultural knowledge would disappear even faster than technical knowledge. The literature, music, art, and philosophical traditions that have shaped human thought for thousands of years would become irrelevant curiosities if they survived at all. Why preserve Shakespeare when everyone's focused on figuring out how to grow food in permafrost? Why maintain orchestras when every able-bodied person is needed for construction and survival work? The few cultural artifacts that did survive would likely be transformed beyond recognition, as they were adapted to the new reality. Religious traditions might evolve to focus entirely on survival and environmental adaptation. Storytelling traditions might become entirely practical, focusing on preserving essential survival knowledge rather than entertainment or moral instruction. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this cultural collapse would be the loss of humanity's sense of its own potential. Right now, even in the poorest communities on Earth, people have some awareness that human beings have walked on the moon, built machines that can think, created art of transcendent beauty. This awareness of human capability provides a foundation for hope and ambition even in desperate circumstances. Remove that awareness, and you remove something essential to the human spirit. The post-Axis survivors wouldn't just be struggling with physical survival. They'd be struggling with a form of existential poverty that no human generation has ever experienced. The complete loss of knowledge about what their species is capable of achieving. This makes the preservation of memory one of the most critical challenges facing any survivor community. But how do you preserve complex knowledge when all the systems designed for that preservation have failed? How do you maintain libraries when the buildings are uninhabitable? How do you keep electronic records when there's no reliable power? How do you pass down technical expertise when the teachers are too busy surviving to teach and the students are too busy learning survival skills to study? Some communities might develop new forms of knowledge preservation adapted to their harsh circumstances. Oral traditions that encode essential technical information in memorable stories and songs. Apprenticeship systems that prioritize the most critical skills. Simplified versions of complex technologies that can be built and maintained with limited resources. But even these adapted preservation systems would face constant pressure from the immediate demands of survival. Every hour spent teaching someone about the old world is an hour not spent on growing food, building shelter, or defending against environmental threats. The short-term survival needs would constantly compete with the long-term need to preserve human knowledge and capability. This tension would create a form of cultural triage that no human society has ever had to perform. Which knowledge is essential enough to preserve at the cost of immediate survival resources? Which cultural traditions are worth maintaining when every calorie and every hour counts? Which aspects of human achievement are so fundamental to who we are as a species that losing them would mean losing our humanity itself? Different communities would inevitably make different choices about these trade-offs, leading to rapid cultural divergence among survivor populations. Some might prioritize scientific and technical knowledge, becoming communities of engineers and inventors focused on rebuilding technological capability. Others might prioritize cultural and artistic knowledge, becoming communities of storytellers and artists focused on preserving the soul of humanity. Still others might reject the old world entirely, developing new cultural forms adapted to their changed circumstances. These communities might see the axis shift not as a catastrophe to recover from, but as a liberation from the mistakes and limitations of previous human civilization. This cultural divergence could lead to the emergence of distinct human subspecies, not just biologically, but culturally. Communities separated by vast distances and harsh environmental barriers, making different choices about what knowledge to preserve and what values to prioritize, could develop into what are essentially different forms of human civilization. Some might become highly technological, focusing all their resources on rebuilding scientific capability as quickly as possible. Others might become deeply ecological, developing intimate knowledge of their local environment and living in close harmony with natural systems. Still others might become nomadic, developing sophisticated systems for adapting quickly to changing environmental conditions. The question of whether these divergent communities would ever be able to reunite and share knowledge would depend heavily on whether global communication and transportation could ever be rebuilt. In the immediate aftermath of an axis shift, communities would be isolated not just by distance, but by the breakdown of all the technological systems that currently connect different parts of the world. Rebuilding these connections would require not just technical knowledge, but enormous resource investment at a time when every community would be struggling just to meet basic survival needs. The communities that managed to rebuild communication capability first would have enormous advantages in terms of accessing knowledge and resources from other regions. This could create a feedback loop where the communities that were most successful in the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe would become increasingly dominant over time, while communities that struggled with initial survival would fall further and further behind in terms of technological capability and resource access. The long-term result might be a world where human civilization exists at multiple levels simultaneously. Advanced communities with rebuilt technology and global communication, intermediate communities with limited technology focused on regional survival, and primitive communities reduced to subsistence living with little knowledge of the outside world. This stratification would be unlike anything in current human society because it would be based not on historical inequalities or political systems, but on fundamental differences in access to knowledge and resources following a planetary catastrophe. The gaps between different levels of human civilization could become so vast that the advanced communities might not even recognize the primitive ones as the same species. But here's what should really keep you awake at night. This stratification process wouldn't happen gradually over centuries. It would happen within decades, maybe within a single generation. The exponential nature of technological development means that small initial advantages compound quickly into enormous differences in capability. A community that managed to preserve electrical generation capability would quickly advance beyond communities that didn't. A community that maintained medical knowledge would have population advantages that would translate into technological advantages. A community that preserved agricultural expertise would have food security that would allow them to invest in other forms of development. These advantages would compound so rapidly that within 20 or 30 years, you could have communities living with technology levels separated by centuries of development. The advanced communities might have rebuilt global communication networks and developed new technologies specifically adapted to post-Axis conditions, while the struggling communities might still be focused on basic survival, with tools and techniques that wouldn't have been out of place in the medieval period. The psychological impact of this stratification on both the advanced and primitive communities would be profound. The advanced communities might develop a sense of superiority and destiny, seeing themselves as the rightful inheritors of human civilization. They might view the struggling communities not as fellow survivors deserving of help, but as evolutionary dead ends that failed to adapt properly to the new world. Meanwhile, the struggling communities might develop a sense of abandonment and resentment, particularly if they had knowledge of the advanced communities but lacked the resources to catch up. This could lead to conflicts that go beyond simple resource competition to existential struggles about what form humanity should take in the post-Axis world. The advanced communities would face their own internal challenges as they grappled with questions about their responsibility to help struggling communities versus their need to continue advancing to ensure their own long-term survival. These moral dilemmas would be complicated by practical concerns about resource allocation and the risk that helping primitive communities might slow their own development, enough to make them vulnerable to future environmental changes. Some advanced communities might develop a missionary approach, actively working to bring technology and knowledge to struggling communities. Others might adopt an isolationist approach, focusing entirely on their own development, while avoiding contact with less advanced groups. Still others might take an exploitative approach, using their technological advantages to extract resources and labor from primitive communities. These different approaches to inter-community relations would shape the long-term trajectory of post-Axis human civilization in ways that could determine whether humanity eventually reunites as a single species or permanently fragments into distinct groups with different evolutionary paths. The question of genetic divergence adds another layer of complexity to this scenario. While cultural and technological differences might emerge within decades, genetic differences would take much longer to develop. However, the extreme environmental pressures and population bottlenecks following an axis shift could accelerate evolutionary processes in ways that might normally take thousands of years. Small, isolated populations adapting to extreme environmental conditions could experience rapid genetic drift and selection pressures that could lead to measurable genetic differences within a few hundred years. Communities adapting to permanent cold might develop genetic variations related to cold tolerance and vitamin D synthesis. Communities adapting to extreme heat might develop variations related to heat tolerance and UV resistance. More dramatically, communities that manage to incorporate genetic engineering technology into their post-Axis development might actively direct their own evolution in ways that could create much more rapid genetic divergence. A technologically advanced community with knowledge of genetic engineering might modify themselves for optimal survival in their specific environmental conditions, creating genetic changes that would be impossible through natural selection alone. This possibility raises profound questions about the future of human identity. If different survivor communities diverge both culturally and genetically, at what point do they stop being the same species? At what point does the diversity of post-Axis humanity become so great that the concept of a unified human race becomes meaningless? These questions aren't just philosophical. They have practical implications for how survivor communities relate to each other and how they think about their own future development. A community that sees itself as part of a larger human family has different moral obligations and development priorities than a community that sees itself as a distinct species competing with other human-derived species for survival and resources. The answers to these questions would likely vary dramatically between different communities based on their specific circumstances, cultural values, and technological capabilities. Some communities might maintain a strong commitment to human unity and work actively to prevent divergence. Others might embrace divergence as a natural and beneficial adaptation to changed circumstances. The communities that actively pursue genetic modification might see themselves as the vanguard of human evolution, carrying the species forward into new forms adapted to post-Axis conditions. The communities that maintain traditional human genetics might see themselves as the guardians of authentic humanity, preserving what it means to be human against artificial modification. These different approaches to human identity and evolution would create tensions that could persist for centuries, shaping not just the biological future of humanity, but the philosophical and cultural understanding of what it means to be human in a world where the definition of humanity itself is no longer fixed. And yet, despite all these possibilities for fragmentation and conflict, there's also the potential for something unprecedented in human history: the conscious, deliberate evolution of human civilization based on hard-won knowledge about the fragility and preciousness of complex society. The survivors of an axis shift would have experienced firsthand how quickly everything we take for granted can disappear. This knowledge might make them more committed than any previous human generation to building resilient, sustainable systems that could survive future catastrophes. They might develop new forms of technology specifically designed for robustness rather than efficiency. New forms of social organization based on redundancy and adaptability rather than specialization and optimization. New forms of knowledge preservation that assume periodic catastrophic loss rather than assuming continuity. This could lead to a form of human civilization that is simultaneously more primitive and more advanced than what we have now. More primitive in terms of material comfort and technological complexity, but more advanced in terms of wisdom about how to build societies that can endure in an uncertain world. The post-Axis survivors would be building civilization not from ignorance about catastrophic risk, but from intimate knowledge of it. Every system they created would be designed with the assumption that it might need to survive another planetary catastrophe. Every institution would be built to function even when larger support systems failed. This might result in human communities that are more resilient, more cooperative, and more conscious of their environmental limits than any societies in human history. The harsh lessons learned from the axis shift catastrophe could ultimately lead to forms of human civilization that are better adapted for long-term survival than anything we've achieved in our current period of planetary stability. But achieving this positive outcome would require the survivors to resist the natural human tendency towards short-term thinking and competition for immediate resources. It would require them to maintain hope and cooperation even in the face of overwhelming challenges. It would require them to preserve and build upon the best aspects of human knowledge and culture, even while adapting to radically changed circumstances. Whether humanity could rise to this challenge would depend on choices made by individual survivors and communities during the crucial early years following the catastrophe. The decisions made in those first desperate months and years could echo through centuries of human development, determining not just whether our species survives, but what kind of species we become. And this brings us to perhaps the most important realization of all. While an overnight axis shift is an extreme and unlikely scenario, the fundamental challenges it would create are not entirely different from the challenges humanity faces in our current era of rapid environmental and technological change. We're already living through a period when many of our basic assumptions about how the world works are being challenged by climate change, technological disruption, and social upheaval. We're already facing questions about how to preserve essential knowledge and values while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. We're already grappling with the tension between short-term survival needs and long-term planning for an uncertain future. So there you have it. From a simple 12-degree shift that would throw our weather into chaos to an extreme 90-degree flip that would essentially end life as we know it, an overnight axis change would rewrite every rule of existence on this planet. We've seen how it would collapse our infrastructure, fragment our civilization, and force the survivors into a completely different relationship with Earth itself. But here's what should really stick with you. This isn't just a thought experiment about an impossible scenario. It's a mirror reflecting how fragile everything we take for granted really is. Every sunrise, every season, every stable system that allows you to live your life depends on our planet maintaining that perfect 23.5-degree tilt. Tonight, when you look up at those same stars our ancestors used to navigate their world, remember that the ground beneath your feet and the sky above your head exist in a balance more delicate than we dare to imagine.